Then I went to graduate school for archaeology, and I went off to my first dig in northwest Nebraska,
Right.
Mandan Villages, and I got off the van and looked around at the place where we were supposed to be spending the next few weeks, and there was a lot of dirt. There were no toilets.
It is a
there
dig.
were a couple of wind-beaten tents, and I said, oh my God, I started to sort of go, oh my gosh, I had no idea what I was getting myself into. And meanwhile, there were some things that needed to go back to the museum, that objects that they had found.
Retrieved, right?
Yes. And they said, but somebody's got to go with them to courier these back. And my hand went straight up. And that's going to be me.
All of my dancer friends completely got it. Oh, of course, architecture school.
Wow.
That's great. I got into architecture school. You were a what? So I had to.
But again, it just as in listening to you, and I love this story, just as in listening to you, it's a powerful reminder to people that our lives can have, and in particular our careers, twists and turns, right? And don't let anybody tell you you can't go from being a dancer in New York City to an architect.
In Chicago.
In Chicago. Yeah, exactly. I mean, what a powerful statement about, not only resilience and ambition, but also, like you said, I love that. Paying it to, you said, oh, I just found those things easy. Hey, those are skills and capabilities you had, right? In this episode of my Remarkable podcast, we dive deep into the unique worlds of Jennifer Sauer-Chevreau and Sally Levine. Jennifer is a passionate museum and fine arts consultant, and Sally is an accomplished architect. Each of them have really interesting stories. Jennifer went to school, majored in archaeology, and when she arrived at her first dig, she decided, nope, this is not for me. And through an interesting series of twists and turns, she ended up as a museum consultant. Sally started her career as a contemporary dancer in New York City, living in the village, living the dream. But then, like all dancers, she realized that, this is a career that might only last 10 years, and I need to find what my next thing will be. She had a passion and a skill for all things graphic design and decided, hey, I think I'll become an architect. She applied and was accepted into school in Chicago, graduated, landed a job at a major architectural firm, and continues her career as an architect both in her own practice as well as a professor. And now, my conversations with Jennifer and Sally on my Remarkable podcast. All right. This is Mark Good and another episode of my Remarkable podcast, recorded here in Shaker Heights at its beautiful main library. And I'm delighted to have two guests with me on the show today. I'm just going to use the first names because I feel like I know them already, Jennifer and Sally. But rather than leave it at that, let me turn to each of you and ask you to introduce yourself. Jennifer?
Hi, I'm Jennifer Sauer-Chevreau. I am a Shaker resident, and I am the principal and founder of Illumin Creative Solutions. And basically that means that I'm a museum and fine arts consultant for people who have collections.
Wonderful, wonderful. Okay, we're going to get back to you in a minute, but our second guest is...
Sally Levine. I'm an architect, and my firm is Levine Architecture and Design, and obviously here in Shaker.
That's great. That's great. Well, welcome to both of you. I want to start the discussion today with you, Jennifer. And although you gave a brief introduction to who you are and what you do, why don't you expand on that a little bit, and so that our listeners can understand a little bit more about what you do? Because and we'll have links in the show notes. So I looked at your website, I read it, and I was so fascinated. I said, I can't wait to do this podcast. But tell us what you do.
So no 2 days of my work are exactly the same, but in a nutshell, what I do is I help organizations and individuals, sometimes families or corporations, who have collections. And it looks different for each organization. When I work with museums, sometimes we're working with the collections themselves, but often we're talking strategically about how they manage, interpret, share, preserve collections, how they set up their organization for success, because owning a collection, especially a museum collection, is very expensive and time consuming, and it takes a lot of staff and professionalism, and that takes a lot of strategy to do successfully. On a smaller scale, when I work with individuals or corporations, sometimes it's somebody who has a passion for collecting something in particular. We as humans have a penchant for collecting. Even people who say they're super minimalist now and they don't have it, if you get onto their hard drive, they have tons of games. They just can't stop themselves. There's usually something that somebody's passionate about that they collect.
So me being called a pack rat is in a different context might be a good thing.
You are my target market.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good to know. But not a hoarder. So.
No. Well, so there is a fine line sometimes between people who are super avid collectors and those who have a hoard. We all have that little dragon inside of us that wants to keep all of it.
Yes.
And one of the things that I do help individuals or families do is when there's someone who's actively collecting, organize that, keep the provenance information, which is all of the documentation of what they have.
Right.
For any collection, including museums, the most important thing is to know what you have and how to take care of it. And individuals need that information as well. And then corporations sometimes even have artwork that was purchased when an architect or a designer came in, 20, 30 years ago and redid the space, and they put artwork in the space. And now they want a different look, or they want to know what to do with it or how to organize it. And I'll help with that as well.
So just a brief short story, and then I want to pivot to ask you to tell us a little bit about your career. Years ago in the land before time, a venture capitalist that I work with, he's now passed, but his name was Vin Prothro. He was a very high profile guy in Dallas, right? So he had a Harvard MBA, and he, along with a guy named LJ7, started a semiconductor company in Dallas. And, they raised capital, they did all this kind of stuff. Well, Vin, because he came from sort of a high net worth family, oil and gas and so forth, he loved artwork. So he collected artwork. And they had all this beautiful artwork on display in the business throughout, kind of the executive area, right? So after a while, they decided to sell the company, and they did. Vin later financed a company that I helped run. And he was telling me one day, he said, "Mark, I made more money on the artwork. We made more money on the sale of the artwork than the sale of the business."
Oh, yeah. And I think that's one of the things that sometimes people when I work with families, they don't know what they have.
Right.
Mom and dad were collectors. They think that they have something really amazing because, it was a high value furniture collection in the 1980s and 90s. Unfortunately, a lot of that furniture isn't high value anymore. Or, it'll be somebody who says, "I think my mom just collected like a local artwork. She was friends with a lot of artists, but I don't think any of it is worth anything." And then I come in and I'm like, "Oh my gosh, your mom was friends with some pretty spectacular artists who, they don't know. Sure. And they don't know what to do with it. They don't know if they should keep it. If they're going to keep it, they say, which ones should I keep? And there's a connoisseurship piece that goes with that, helping them like, I don't want to keep everything that mom had, but what should I keep?
Right.
And what do I need to know about it? Because I don't know anything about artwork. Usually they know more than they think they know,
right.
But they don't know how to keep the paper trail. They don't know how to organize things. They don't know if it's works on paper that they shouldn't put it in a sunny window.
Right.
I love to put it in this bright room. And I'm like, I love that too. But this is a watercolor. And so, I can work on the small scale like that. And then sometimes there are museums that need that information too, because they may be a museum that's focused on one particular thing, and then they find in a collection something that they don't know anything about. So helping them figure that out, or, strategy of like, do we keep everything just because we're a museum? Sometimes keeping everything is unsustainable. So we'll talk about that too.
Okay. So we were talking about this before the show, as we like to say, off mic. And as we were chatting a little bit, I looked at you and I said, "I've never met anybody that does what you do." So tell us a little bit about how you got into this business. I mean, what's your career path been?
So I feel like I am emblematic of many of my museum colleagues, that it is not a straight line from, deciding to go off to college and then someday becoming an art consultant or a museum person.
So what was your undergraduate degree?
Yeah. So I went to the University of Michigan, which is extremely popular here in Ohio.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Once a year.
Yes. And I went there thinking that I would study English and poli-sci and become a lawyer. And I got there and found out that at a huge university like that, there were so many interesting things to study. And I ended up being a part of the Medieval and Renaissance Collegium. And
Interesting.
Yeah, with a double major in anthropology. And my particular interest was in archaeology. So then I went to graduate school for archaeology. And I went off to my first dig in northwest Nebraska.
Right.
Mandan Villages, and I got off the van and looked around at the place where we were supposed to be spending the next few weeks, and there was a lot of dirt. There were no toilets.
It is a
there
dig.
were a couple of wind-beaten tents, and I said, "Oh my God!" I started to sort of go, "Oh my gosh!" I had no idea what I was getting myself into. And meanwhile, there were some things that needed to go back to the museum, that objects that they had found.
Retrieved, right?
Yes. And they said, but somebody's got to go with them to courier these back. And my hand went straight up. And that's going to be me. And then when I got back to the museum at grad school, I went into the lab, the archaeology lab, and said, here's the stuff. And they said, great, actually, why don't you begin working on these? And it was refitting flint flakes to a core, which is, if you don't know what that is, it's basically taking tiny little chips of stone and trying to fit them back together to figure out how big the original stone was.
That's like putting a puzzle together without an image to
when
guide
all
you.
of it is exactly the same color, and it's very small and you're looking through a microscope, and it was very quiet in there. And I'm not a very quiet person. And I kept looking over at other people's microphones and trays going, what do you have over there? Same thing as you. What are you doing? Same thing as you. And then a friend who was in charge of the lab said, here's the thing. I'm sensing that you're not really getting excited about the work that you're doing, but I have this project. And she said, we've gotten some money from the university to redo the downstairs interpretive area, which was basically the cultural museum for that part. I was at the University of Missouri, so it was Columbia, Missouri, and the schools would come in, and it hadn't been redone in a really long time. And she said, I don't see anything wrong with it, but they say it's not kid friendly. And I said, okay, I can totally do this. And that was my first little really feeling. I had worked in the registration at the Art Museum at Michigan, but this was hands-on, getting to develop a space, thinking about the end user, how do they get excited about archaeology?
Right.
And then I decided this is really what I wanted to do. I really wanted to work in museums. I really wanted to work with people who were trying to express the enthusiasm and excitement they have about digging and flint flakes and all that stuff, and make it interesting, exciting, convey that sort of information to an audience that knows nothing about it. And I still do that. I mean, with a lot of museums are sort of esoteric. And so we have to make that connection to the people who are out there. So I do that today. I still do planning. I'm working with 3 downtown museums to help them sort of revamp their school visits for a modern, but they're small historical museums in downtown Cleveland. And they need to better relate to kids post-COVID who are, have more high tech in their pocket than museums could ever afford. And so developing that programming, thinking strategically about how museums shape what they do, and even with collectors who are thinking about long term, how will my stuff, where should it go to be important? It's so important to me. How does it become important to other people?
I wanted to make a couple of observations about your kind of career journey that I think are, for listeners who are younger in their lives, maybe they're in college or just out of school. There's a couple of things about your journey that I think has happened to a lot of people. One is, it is so common for people to graduate from school, whether it's undergraduate or graduate degree, and jump into the career they've selected and discover once they get there, this is not what I want to do.
Yeah.
I mean, and many universities try really hard to bring what I call real life perspective in. But be that as it may, it's only when you get into the workforce in whatever, career path that you've selected that you really begin to experience what it's like to be that. And
for sure. I think one of the best things about universities, I mean, I've noticed I have a senior, full disclosure, who's graduating this evening from Shaker. And, they were encouraged to share where they're going and what they're going to major in. And
right.
I smile every time I see those because, most of them have something there. A lot of them don't say undecided, like when I was graduating
sure.
and going into school. But, it'll be interesting. I hope that many of them go off and find something completely different. Not because I don't want them to be successful, but because I want them to be curious. I want them to take an art history class or an anthropology class or a geology class, or something that they never thought they were, philosophy,
right.
and get curious, and also to realize that you can be an accountant and work at a museum. I'm not trying to get everybody to work at museums, but there are marketing people at museums. There are all kinds of finance people who work at the zoo. Like, you can work in a cool environment if you're really interested in animals. It doesn't mean that you can't be, in marketing. They need that too. So, yeah.
I think the other thing that I noticed as you were telling your story is, and it's really powerful, and I've heard this from many, many, many people. You got into the museum setting. I love that. You're at the microscope, you're looking through it. You turn to others, go, what are you doing? Same as you. But there was someone in leadership who looked at you and said, why don't you try this?
Yeah.
And that is a powerful role that people can play in organizations, that leadership role of mentoring people, of looking at someone and going, you're not happy there, you belong over here, or try this over here, right?
Yeah.
That is so powerful because many of us, when we enter the workforce, have this feeling of, we're young, and many of us feel kind of helpless. It's like, well, I'm now working for this company. What do I do? And what do people expect? And right. And so one of the positive roles that a leader can take in an organization, when I use the word leader, it's a manager, right, is to really mentor and guide these entry-level folks in an organization into a path that may be a better fit for their skills, their personality, all those things. And that certainly sounds like it happened to you.
Well, and to sort of listen to that inner voice that you have that says, this isn't what I want to be doing now.
Right.
And that was sort of how I ended up doing the work that I'm doing today, is that I was working for 6 years for the ICA, which is the Intermuseum Conservation Association. It's the regional nonprofit art conservation center for this part of the country. And I loved working there. I still love working with them. They're fantastic. And they have conservators working in paintings, paper, textiles, objects. I was education and institutional advancement there and loved it. But I was frequently picking up the phone, and there would be somebody on the phone who says, okay, I know that you can fix my things because I've had you guys work on my collection. But what I don't know is I need somebody to help me organize it. I need somebody to help me go through it, figure out what I have. I need somebody to come here and help me put the provenance together and box it. Do you have somebody who does that? And I said, we actually don't do that. And there was a little bug in my ear the more I had to answer questions like that. Do you have anybody who could come? My mom was a good client of yours. She's now going into care, and we have to figure out what to do with her collection. Do you have anybody who you could point us to do that? And I realized the more and more I answered those questions, that I wanted that to be me. I knew how to do that, and I wanted to be the person to do that. And I couldn't do that at the ICA, but I felt like I could build some kind of practice, and I wasn't sure what it would look like exactly, where I could sort of be the curator that they needed, the administrator that they needed, short term or mid-length term, helping institutions and individuals kind of figure it out.
Well, isn't that, and I love that story because that also is a strong, in the tech world, we say you were picking up what are called demand signals. Another person might say you were paying attention to market feedback.
Yeah.
Right. Others would say, again, years ago, find a need and fill it.
Yeah.
Right. Or scratch that itch. Right.
Yeah.
You did all those things. And again, I think for our listeners, that is a really powerful thing. And by the way, I'll just make this observation as is somebody who next month moves into, celebrates 7 decades of going around the sun, right? You can do that, make that change anytime.
Yeah.
Now, there may be, and understandably so, financial constraints and so forth. But if that little, like you said, the bug in the ear starts saying, you need to do this or pay attention to that, right?
Yeah.
Because that's really powerful. Now, talk a little bit about what you do today. So if you said to me earlier in our discussion, hey, you'd be my target client. Tell me a little bit about what you do, who your clients are, kind of why they hire you.
Sure.
And what you do for them.
So, for example, I mostly get my clients by referral. So people meet me and they go, oh, I've never met anybody like you, which is kind of good because then they don't forget generally that they met a person like me.
Jennifer, the museum
and
lady.
they can usually Google Jennifer, the art consultant. Where was I? I don't know, Cleveland. And I probably will come up. And we talk about what I do with families. Like I was mentioning that I can, if somebody's downsizing, I can help them figure out what they have.
Great.
And sort of, compassionately hold their hand through that process to figure out where things go. So sometimes I work with auction houses. Sometimes I work with estate sale people or just helping them organize things that are going to be going to grandchildren. They're like, oh, my children and grandchildren don't want anything. Well, sometimes it's because they don't want to come to their house and think about the mortality piece. It's very uncomfortable.
Oh, yeah.
It makes them feel sad thoughts.
Sure.
And what I help them do is package it with information, with photographs sometimes of the people who own these things. These were your great-great-grandmothers. Well, let's put her whole name in there.
Oh, that's
let's
so
put
cool.
Photographs from her wedding. Do we have a picture of her at a cocktail party in the 1960s at her house, sipping out of these martini glasses? Yes,
Right.
Great. Let's put that in there and package it in a way that when they get it as a gift, no one returns that gift. No one says, I don't want that.
And also, just in listening to you describe it, okay, so like I said, I'm a collector. I'm a pretty avid amateur photographer. I have a huge, image collection.
Yeah.
Right? It's kind of the story of my life, right? But the way you've described packaging that, so an object with the name, the provenance, right?
Yeah.
And then an image.
And the context.
That tells a story.
Well, and that's what museums do. So that's why I know how to do that. Because as a curator, that's what I always had to do. I couldn't just put, some teacup in a room with no context and have you understand why you're looking at this. It's kind of the same in our family relationships. Like if you just give some dishes to a kid, they're like, seriously, I have to store this for the rest of my life? Why? Well, the why is the part of the story that we have to tell,
right.
And so I help with that. And then like tomorrow, I'm going to be over at Tower East, which is the Gropius building here in Shaker, because I work with E2G on their corporate collection. So we'll be installing some artwork that I helped acquire for them from a Cleveland auction. Some of them are pieces by local artists. Some of them are not. And if you walk into Tower East and you see the artwork that's in the lobby, by and large, I have helped them curate that collection. That building is now on the National Register of Historic Places. Try not to let that sink in too much that 1960s building is a historical building.
Well, for me, that's really haunting.
I know.
That's something that was a part of
crazy,
my
right?
time frame is now.
But they wanted artwork that really celebrated that moment, that mid-century moment. And so we've been doing that together. So tomorrow I'll be doing an art install over there. And then yesterday, I said no, 2 days are exactly the same. I was working at a magic museum that's here in Cleveland. It's a private museum that a man who is entirely passionate about magic. He does magic himself, but all of his adult sort of professional life, he's been collecting magic ephemera,
wow.
Like all kinds of objects, giant posters, a huge archive and a library. And he made his own museum, and I helped him do that along with a team of other professionals that I work with. And so on Tuesdays, you'll find me at the Averbrook Magic Art Museum and Library. So yeah.
How many private, okay, so another short story. Years ago, I was doing some consulting for the Army, and I was working with a research group based in Natick, Massachusetts, which is about 20 miles west of Boston.
Yep.
Okay? And one day things were kind of slow, and we were part of a large team of people. they brought us all together and said, we want to take you to a museum, a private museum. And we said, what is it? And he said, this collector collects things from World War II. And I was like, well, okay. And I've seen, medals and,
Sure.
Nazi stuff.
The
SS
drawer
daggers.
everybody has.
Yeah, exactly. Right. We walk in. I mean, this place was probably 20 or 30,000 square feet.
Yeah.
And we walk in. He has tanks. He has Jeeps. He had one of the 5 signed copies of the surrender agreement between the United States and Japan. I mean, it was amazing. But it's private. I mean, the reason we got in is because we were affiliated with the Army. And he feels like we'd be a safe audience because he doesn't have guards and surveillance and all that, right?
Yep.
It's just opened this door. And I mean, oh my gosh. And it was all, they must have hired somebody like you. It was all labeled properly. It was all contextualized.
Yeah, it's incredible how passionate people can be about this stuff. And, it doesn't have to, the wonderful thing about private museum for those people is that they don't have to relate to other audiences all the time.
Right.
There are huge collector groups, and the wonderful thing about social media and the internet is that they find each other and then they just sort of feed off of each other, this amazing collecting frenzy that they have. It's wonderful as a person who really cares about cultural heritage, that they're preserving it, because museums could never on their own preserve all of it. And there are these people who love it. And then thinking about how they keep that legacy, or what is the intention after that private museum.
After they pass.
Yeah. That's some of the strategy that takes place with a private group. But you'd be surprised how many private museums there are. And anytime anybody invites you to one, you definitely want to go, yeah, I want to see that. Because it's usually somebody's trove.
Right, right. Well, let me turn to our second guest, Sally. And Sally Levine. And Sally, please introduce yourself and tell us what you do.
Okay, I am Sally Levine. I am an architect, although I often use the alliteration architect, artist, and academic, as those are all parts of what I do. And my practice is Levine Architecture and Design, and we do almost anything, residential, commercial, institutional. We've even done a little industrial over the years. I would like to say that I had a brilliant business plan that told me to be diverse, because in 2008, when the economy tanked, I only had institutional and business clients. And then during COVID, I only had residential clients.
Interesting.
So my lack of focus has actually served me really well.
Well, you've been, as we'd say, you've been agile and you've been responsive to the market.
See, again, that makes me sound like such a good business.
Congratulations. Oh, no, you are. That's
Thank
wonderful.
you.
Well, hey, listen, the very fact, even in telling your story, the very fact that you were able to transition from institutional to residential during those, times of change, right? That's a big deal. So, yeah, props to you. I mean, you may not have thought, well, gee, I'm a smart business person. Listen, you were doing the fundamental thing. You were paying attention to who pays you.
Well, and so my goal is always to have a balanced
Right.
practice, so that when unexpected things arise, I've already got my foot in the door in some area. I'm sure there are other areas I could attempt, but that's basically what we do. We also do some graphic design work. We've done some exhibit design work. Once we built a model that was used in a television movie. So
Wow.
some really funny and interesting projects have found their way to us.
So how did you get into the architectural field? I mean, what's kind of the journey been like? The listener can't see your face, but you're kind of grimacing and smiling at that question.
Okay, I am not a person who knew at birth that I was going to be an architect. And there are a bunch of people. There are a bunch of architects.
We had one on our show.
Alicia?
No, Christine Medvedev.
Oh,
Who said, literally, she goes, I said, well, when did you decide to be an architect? She goes, when I was 10. And I mean, she's done it, right? It's pretty
Right.
incredible. Anyway, back to you.
right. So I am not one of those people.
Okay.
At all. I went to college to Washington U. I had a double major in dance and English lit.
Oh, cool.
I moved to New York. I pursued dance. I worked at a dance theater. I had also always taken art classes. And somebody, one of the founders of this performance space, asked me to put together a flyer for something coming up. And he gave me some press-on letters because it was pre-computer.
Sure.
And I thought it was sort of fun, and I just sort of did it. And when something is easy for me, I just think it's easy. I don't necessarily think that it took some very special skill to be able to do that. But when he came back, his name was Art Bauman, and when he came back, he was really complimentary about what I had put together. And he was a dancer, also a choreographer, and he did a lot of graphic design work. And he said, if you want, I can, maybe we can work together. I can feed you some projects. And he got me into that area of design. I'd also taken a lot of photography classes, and all of this stuff.
It sounds like this was early in your career, so you may have been in your 20s when this happened?
Yes, I was in my 20s. I was living in New York. I lived in the Village. I was a struggling artist.
Yeah,
I was doing the whole deal,
Yeah, I was going to say, that's a wonderful time in life.
Yes. A couple things happened while I was there. For whatever reasons, I had a lot of friends who were about 10 years older than I was. And dance is a short life as a career. And I would see people starting to question what were they going to do next, what was happening for them.
Is it short because it's so hard on the body?
Yes, because of the physical aspects. It's like being
it's an athlete.
An athlete, yes. It's
Right.
the same thing. So I may have started thinking about that a little sooner than I otherwise would have. And
Don't tell me you're not a business person. That's strategic thinking.
oh my goodness.
Strategic career planning.
See, and I thought I was always a person who never had goals. Okay. I never write them down like people say you should. Anyway, for whatever reasons, between the work at my little drawing board and my going to take dance classes and to do some performing and all of that, it seemed to me that the perfect marriage of all of those things, two-dimensional design, three-dimensional space, four-dimensional time, they all came together in my mind in architecture.
Sure.
So it seemed to me to be the obvious next step in life. All of my dancer friends completely got it. Oh, of course, architecture school.
Wow.
That's great. I got into architecture school. You were a what? So I had to.
But again, it just as in listening to you, and I love this story, just as in listening to you, it's a powerful reminder to people that our lives can have, and in particular our careers, twists and turns, right? And don't let anybody tell you you can't go from being a dancer in New York City to an architect.
In Chicago.
In Chicago. Yeah, exactly. I mean, what a powerful statement about, not only resilience and ambition, but also, like you said, I love that. Paying it you said, oh, I just found those things easy. Hey, those are skills and capabilities you had, right?
Well, that's what I learned because Art was so enthusiastic about my work that I kind of realized that I suppose not everybody could do that.
Right.
So that was a little learning experience for me.
Where'd you go to school, architecture school?
University of Illinois in Chicago.
Okay, wow.
And then I spent 9 years working for 3 different firms. The probably most important firm that I worked for was Halliburton Root. It's an old historic firm. Quite frankly, it was a little bit like getting into the college of my choice. When I got that job, I was really very excited. And that's why I know how to put together a set of documents for building design. I know what project I worked on when I learned to do which details.
Right.
As a small business, my experience at a substantial major firm, I think elevates the way that I approach the work.
Sure.
And I would say that other people who have had those experiences share that with me. If you've just always worked for small firms,
There's stuff you don't learn.
and so you can't bring that to your own practice either. So
Great point.
I'm very grateful for what I learned, both in terms of business and the professional side of architecture, as much as all the other pieces, the design, how you work with clients, all of that stuff. So it was after 3 firms and over 9 years that I first went off on my own.
Was that decision to go on your own scary, intimidating, filled with uncertainty, or did you have, as I suspect may be the case, such confidence? I mean, it's sort of like, Jennifer, all the people that were asking you, when you work for that organization, do you do? And you kept shaking your head no.
Right.
And the little voice says, oh, that could be a business, right? Tell me about that transition from working for an established enterprise to moving out on your own. What was that like?
2 things, I think. At that point, I had started teaching at the School of the Art Institute in Chicago.
Wow.
And while I was part-time, I was teaching enough that I had health insurance.
Oh.
Which is...
It's huge.
Yeah, isn't that such an issue? I mean, it's like a through line for so many people in the country, in the United States, is, but do they have health insurance? Or how can I get health insurance? Okay, cool. Really, really important. Yeah.
So there's that. I think a good majority of architects want to do their own work. I think there's something about the type of person who selects architecture as a profession that makes them more apt to start their own practice.
Well, I think what's important for people, maybe people who aren't aware, people who are architects like yourself are fundamentally very creative. You have to be, because you're solving a problem, you're coming up with a solution. It's 3-dimensional. It's a structure. It's got to be built, etc. It takes a lot of creativity to do that. You're not a draftsperson. You're not a draftsman, right? I mean that's a part of it,
right?
But at the highest level, you're solving a problem, coming up with a solution, likely. And the reason you're doing it is because an off-the-shelf solution doesn't exist, right? I mean, that's why they hire you, right?
Right.
So I can see that impulse of creativity driving someone to go, I'd really like to be my own boss. I mean, that makes sense to me.
So it's very common. The vast majority of architects actually work for firms of 10 or less.
Oh, interesting.
There are some very large national firms, but compared to some other industries, on balance, there are many, many more small firms and solo or partnerships that people start because of those impulses, the things that brought us to architecture school to begin with.
So have you been then running your own firm since you made that transition out of the 3 enterprises in Chicago?
Well, then I was offered a full-time academic position in Boston at a small college called the Boston Architectural College. I was a department chair there. And so I thought I was going to stay in Chicago forever. And then I ended up moving to Boston. And so while I was full-time there in an academic environment, I did a few projects on the side. It was a different balance. I came back here, which I never thought I would do, but I came back here. My father was ill.
Did you grow up here?
I grew up here.
I forgot to ask you that. I mean, we're going to talk in a moment, the 3 of us, about Shaker, but I missed that part of your story. That
I am a complete product of Shaker Heights, Ohio. Wow. Born, bred, raised, all of that.
Well, certainly as a new resident of the city, we can take pride in this amazing career as I listen to you.
Yeah.
So you were in Boston. So your dad got ill and you said, I need to come back here.
Right. I also need to say that we were very lucky because we had full-time help.
Yeah.
And I know I contributed a lot to the quality of his life. I know I was able to supervise things and things like that. I did not, however, have to do most of the heavy lifting.
Sure.
And for that, I got the best parts of my dad, who had dementia, and usually knew who I was, but sometimes didn't.
Right.
But liked me even when he didn't know who I was. So that kept me sane, that he didn't like me only when he had to. But I always feel that it's important to acknowledge that we had help in this process.
Sure.
Because not everybody is as fortunate.
So when you came back here, did you secure another teaching job, or maybe it's and you opened your practice? How did that work?
Probably took me a couple months to kind of get up and figure out that I needed to do something. But
Sure.
I started with a practice. I did contact a couple schools because I had taught in Chicago. I taught and administered in Boston. And so here's kind of a nice story that I get to tell on occasion. I had called, somebody told me there were architecture classes offered at Case Western Reserve. There's not an architecture school there, but there used to be in the 70s, and at some point they started offering a couple studios through the art department. And I also felt like, since I had taught at the School of the Art Institute, I had this kind of artsy, architectural combination thing going on. And I just called. I spoke to the the art department chair, and I just was asking about being on reviews to review student work, because that's actually one really nice thing about the architectural community is when we've gone through school, professionals have come back to look at work at the end of a semester. Nobody ever gets paid for that. It's really just giving back to the community. And so I was making that offer. I have since been hired by Case, which is the story I'm going to get to in a second. And people have been very lovely in giving their time to my students there. Anyway, I called, and at that point he said, "Oh, no, we get everybody from the local AIA, the American Institute of Art." Well, if you ever need somebody else. I sort of didn't know how to respond to that. But he said to me, "If you'd like, why don't you send me your vita or resume," whatever it was. And I did. And about a year and a half later, I get a phone call. The person who had been teaching the architecture studios was not returning, and he had asked around to see if there was anybody. And it turns out, and then he said he thought, "I wonder if I have any resumes." And it turns out my resume was good enough that he didn't put it in the circular file. He put it in the actual file. And when he saw my background and credentials, he called me. So for me, again, that urban legend that a resume can get you work, I never quite believed. And then it actually happened to me. So I was hired, and I have been teaching now for several years at Case, part-time. That came maybe 3 or 4 years after I moved back. And having that as a balance to my practice has been really, really rewarding and important to me as a person, as a professional.
Well, it also just, and again, this is, I know absolutely nothing about your personal finances, but as an entrepreneur, having some sort of income base, right, whether it's a side hustle or the main hustle and your side hustle is something else, certainly helps dampen those, up and down of income.
Boy, I would love to say that it really gave me a lot of financial security, but it does not. I do not turn down the paycheck that I receive.
Right. That is such a polite slapback. I love that. Like, yeah, Mark, no.
If only.
If only. Right.
That would be very lovely. But as we all know, adjunct faculty are not necessarily well compensated.
No.
But that's not, I wouldn't do it for free. And I take the paycheck and I appreciate it very much. It is not the only reason.
Right.
It's not the primary reason that I do that. It enriches me in many other ways.
Interesting. So besides that teaching, what are you doing in your practice here?
Well, as I said, we do residential, commercial, institutional, whatever we can do. I have a few people who work with me part-time. That is great. And with computers and Zoom and whatever, we can all work.
Collaborate.
We can collaborate remotely, so that's nice. Not that we don't sometimes also get together. We do a lot of additions. We do a little bit of new construction for homes, but many more additions. Sometimes we do interiors work. Sometimes we combine it all. We like to do the whole thing from soup to nuts. We like to be involved with commercial projects. I often wish people would call me or any architect, quite frankly, before they sign a lease.
Yeah.
Because they sign a lease and then the space doesn't work for the thing that they want. And there was nobody there to give them any advice on that. It might be the right square footage. It might be the right part of town. There are some people over the years for whom I've provided that service. And eventually we find a space, and typically then I do the work. But it is much more pleasant because we're not struggling with a condition that suddenly there's 2 levels and we need to make it accessible. And I'm all in favor of making it accessible. And then they say, we can have a ramp. And I say, yes. And to have a handicap accessible ramp, you need 1 foot of length for every inch. So if this is 36 inches, not only do we need 36 feet, but every 15 feet we need a landing.
Right.
It will take up the entire space. So I like very much when I can help people before they get into that situation.
That's great advice.
And with homes as well as with commercial spaces, but commercial for sure, that becomes problematic. We present things in 3D models. We go to the Architectural Board of Review. We submit things to building departments. We try very hard to get along with everybody in all of the different cities where we work. It always, when issues arise, it is always better to be friends with people to try to find the solution than to be butting heads. There's some of both that comes up. The building code was updated March 1st, so there's
something new.
Sylvia's shaking her head. That has a lot of new requirements related to energy conservation and the environment. I am a LEED accredited professional, what it's called. I have kept up my credentials and do all the CE, so I also have the building design and construction certification. Also, since I lived in Boston, I have been a member of the board of a national organization called the Institute for Human-Centered Design, where we advocate for accessibility of all sorts, not only physically, but cognitively.
Oh, interesting.
We use that a lot in museums.
Yes, of course.
Yes.
Of course.
Wow.
And so, for example, if I'm doing a house and it might be a younger couple and I'll say, so in the bathroom, do you want to have grab bars? And of course they say no because they're young.
Right.
Even though I say they look great now, they have all kinds of new designs. But I will then say, how about if we put blocking behind the wall? So if and when the time comes or when you move and you sell this, you can tell people that the blocking exists. So when they want to put in grab bars, you don't have to tear down the wall to put in the blocking to do that.
But I think that's also one of the strengths and important value add that somebody like yourself provides a homeowner who, I mean, most of us, first of all, most of us don't, unless we're architects, right, or worked in construction, we don't understand building structure and all that sort of stuff, right? We don't get that. Most people don't. Secondly, we don't think long term like that. That's a great example of that sort of, sort of multi-decade thinking. And because most people they're kind of in the present moment. It's like the example that you just gave, it's a couple, they've got young kids. Why would I ever think about grab bars, right? Well, it depends on how long you live here, and it might be important for you, might be important for a guest, etc. So again, that's part of the value add that a subject matter expert and professional like yourself or Jennifer brings to people, because there's just so much that most of us don't know, right?
Well, I do have to say that nobody has ever said don't put in the blocking.
Right.
Right, exactly.
When you think about the idea of putting that in just into the tile or whatever, and then actually using it. Ugh.
Yeah, but you're ready to go when the time comes.
Right.
And it literally costs you nothing because it's a couple little pieces of wood that is already on the site, and it takes a couple minutes. It doesn't add really to the labor costs, and then you're all set. So those are some of the things that we do.
Well, let's talk a little bit, and I want to open the discussion back up to both of you. We're doing these episodes as a part because all of us here are members of the Shaker home-based businesses. I guess you want to call it working group, whatever. I don't know what the right phrase is, but the entity that the city has set up, which I think is marvelous. And we're all residents of the city, yep. And we all work out of our homes in the city, subject to those times when you go visit your clients, like at museums or, sites and so forth. Tell me a little bit about what your experience has been like having a business such as each of yours in Shaker, right? I mean, has there been anything about Shaker that has added value or been helpful to you as you've either started your business or run your business? Jennifer?
Yes. Shaker is a very connected community to each other and to others outside of the community. So for those of us who don't have a real shingle out,
right.
In my front yard, I could, but I don't know that anybody would notice it. It's a great place to be at Van Aken and have coffee or lunch and run into somebody who says, I talked to a neighbor who's downsizing and they need someone. And people are very supportive of each other and each other's businesses. They want to lift everybody up.
Right.
I've actually did a project with the Shaker Historical Society, their new strategic plan last year. And one of those things is because one of their board members is a teacher at the high school who was my daughter's history teacher. And, she actually didn't know that it was such a neat and tidy connection, although things just kind of in conversation bubble up. I got the work at Tower East several years ago because someone that I grew up with was working in the building there and happened to bump into somebody else who said, I have this meeting with Jennifer. She does art consulting. Jennifer who, and then they actually call you. That's the other thing, is that they care enough in the community to actually reach out. And I did a project here with the library, and they're very good about finding the people in our neighborhood who can help. I think that's a really great thing about being here.
So, Sally, what's your experience been like?
The architecture is quite varied and pretty wonderful here. And so there's an example of sort of everything. And if I'm stuck or
within the city.
Within the city. Within
Interesting.
Walking distance. So I can just walk out of my house, take a walk around the block or a few blocks away. Or I can drive to a different part and park and just look around. And the dormer can be flush with the house. It can be up on the roof. It can be protruding in front of the front wall. And I can see all of those examples, and I can say, wow, I think this configuration would work best for this. So there's a kind of interesting resource when I walk out the door or drive down the street. Although I try to pay attention to driving, but quite frankly, I love to be a passenger in a car because I would rather look.
When we moved here 3 years ago, I never lived in Northeast Ohio. My wife grew up in Beechwood, and so for her, this was a homecoming. For me, it was new. To your point about architecture, I still, 3 years later, I still am, I'll use a British word here, gobsmacked at some of the homes and the structures that I see. It is amazing, the diversity, and quite frankly, the beauty. And then add to this something that I grew up in the North Texas area in Dallas and suburbs north of that. There's a lot of wonderful things about living there. Climate and the geography, the landscape, all that kind of stuff is not a part of that, right? It's it's the butt end of the plains, right? It used to be cotton fields. It's all flat. There's no trees or few trees. There's not a single, by the way, natural lake in the state of Texas. Every lake that's there is man-made or created, right? So I come to Ohio. Yeah. So I come to Ohio and I'm like, oh my gosh. I mean, there's trees, there's hills, there's rivers, there's waterfalls. I could give a whole long funny story about my first time to go to Chagrin Falls, but it's really remarkable. So to your point, yes, architectural, richness, depth.
It's the first thing I do when people come to visit is I drive them around.
Yes, exactly.
Shaker, and I take them the pretty way, which is what my brothers who live in the Boston area always say. Will you take us the pretty way down to the museums? Yes, I will. Because it's sometimes I'm like, you have to be more specific because we have so many pretty ways down.
Well, I don't think there's any other way to get down to the museums than the pretty ways.
It's all beautiful.
I mean, they do exactly what you say. They don't want to drive it. They want to sit in the car and look out and go, oh, I love it here. It's so pretty. And of course, when I go back to Massachusetts, I do the same thing. Like, oh, I love it here. Being a museum history person, cultural heritage, drive me around and let me do the same thing. But and of course, being here at the edge of the Western Reserve, it feels the same way. But that's it. I mean, we're not short on inspiration here in Shaker.
So talk about people.
Oh, yeah.
So you've talked about structures, which I love. I didn't see that coming. And I think, but you're an architect, right? That makes sense. So talk about people.
So when I moved back, since I'd never thought that I was going to move back, I pretty much lost touch with people that I had grown up with.
Right.
And it took me a while to get connected. And one of the organizations that I am still involved with is the Shaker Arts Council. And through that, I met people. I got some clients. They have been wonderful references for me when a new client or a prospective client wants to talk to somebody for whom I've worked in the past. People have been in other people's homes and they've said, oh, who did that? And I've gotten work that way, which is really quite nice. So for the most part, the people have been very receptive. I am almost equally happy when somebody says that, oh, I wish I met you a year ago or 2 years ago, but we hired so-and-so as an architect. I am always happy when people hire architects for the work as opposed to going to a builder. I think we have value added. Mm-hmm. And hopefully we can help people save money in the construction side of things by the work that we do ahead of time. So all of those connections to people in Shaker, and I've even been able to have prospective clients visit homes here and see some of the work that I've done. And obviously that's a little bit better than just looking on a website or my sending over some pictures or whatever else we may do. And also just over the years, you begin to make friends. People help in referring my name. I also have friends who do all sorts of other things that I can turn to, sometimes to hire, sometimes just to ask a quick question, a piece of advice.
Sure.
And it's a very supportive, I think, a very supportive community. And then I said, the planning department and the building department are wonderful. As I'm saying this, I get along very well with the personnel in the departments I work with. And so when there's a hiccup, and there are hiccups, we've been able to talk it through. So that's been nice.
So let me ask, I'm going to ask you this question, but Jennifer, if you want to chime in, that's fine. But I want to ask you, Sally, one of the distinctives of Shaker as a city is the degree to which the city has, through ordinances, et cetera, and the Architectural Review Board, sort of said, we want to preserve the architecture of the city as best we can. Some have argued that this is a value add because it reminds me a little bit when I lived in Northern Virginia. We'd go to Williamsburg. We lived in Old Town Alexandria. Same sort of thing. There was a historical group that said, nope, anything to do with the front elevation, got to go through this, right? So now for me, this has been a really incredible contrast because where I come from in Dallas in North Texas, right, in the suburb I grew up in, Richardson, right? So the home that my parents bought in 1959 cost them $13,000. Today, homes in that area go for $350,000 to $500,000, which is insane to me because they're tiny. I mean, they're 1,200 square feet. But the other thing is that they tear down everywhere. They tear down. And so what they do is they'll buy a home that's 50 years old and just raze it to the ground and then erect this sort of McMansion monstrosity. Mm-hmm. I don't see that happening in Shaker.
I hope not.
Okay, well, so
am I allowed to say that?
Yes, you're allowed to say
but so Sally, talk a little bit about that, because I think that's a really interesting thing about our city that makes it different. And because I've never, talked about this with any of the people that I've interviewed on my show, now I've got you. So I'm like, okay.
Okay, so I'm of mixed opinion on all of this.
That's fine.
Certainly, in terms of sustainability, the embodied energy that exists in the existing built environment cannot be matched when you tear down and build from scratch. And that's throughout Northeast Ohio, certainly, and then specifically in Shaker. And I agree with some amount of respect for the community and things like that. Left to my own devices, my work is more contemporary. Mm-hmm. And with all due respect to my colleagues on the Architectural Board of Review, the results of having those kinds of committees throughout the world, actually, is that while you avoid having really horrible stuff,
right,
there's a limit oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes there's a limit to the amount you can push the envelope. And I will admit that I, in fact, once gave a paper at an AIA conference expressing my concern about architectural boards of review. And I compared a bunch of different cities' descriptions of what their architectural boards of review do. And it all has to do with fitting in. And it's this very ambiguous kind of language. And unlike the building department where there's a building code and you can at least discuss it,
right,
this is based on people's instincts and
interpretations.
Aesthetics. Yeah.
And in architecture school, we study all of the weird houses at the end of the block, like the famous weird houses. I won't give any examples because nobody will know. But anyway, those are the people we study. And so that's the negative side, is we don't get the people who are pushing the envelope so much. The good side is we have within all of the variation of the housing that we have here and the building stock that we have here, there is a consistency, and certainly a consistency with quality and the use of materials. But I am of mixed, even though I like everybody on the ABR. Be sure to know I like everybody on the ABR. I have mixed feelings about it.
Well, I have to admit the same, because while a person like...
Because you're all about collections.
Well, yeah,
and old stuff.
Art history and archaeology and all of those things, right? The long view, an archaeologist can't help but take the really long view, you know. And those of us who are medievalists, you know, there's a preservation sense that so much has been lost.
Right.
But at the same time, throughout my career, I've worked with living artists, and the amount of creativity and ingenuity and just value that they add through the lens that they apply to the world we see around us. When you don't have space for that, you know, we have a blip then where we haven't added anything new in our decades. And this happened in museums actually when there was all of this collecting up to about World War II. They wanted to collect history up to World War II. So many museums were founded from like 1950, you know, post-war up to about the 80s. And they were collecting everything from World War II and prior.
Interesting.
And then if you go in and you just wanted to find a television from like 1974, they don't have that because nobody was collecting that because it was contemporary and there was no value placed on it in terms of history. And so, you know, if we don't add anything new from architects like Sally and others that have this their own creative oomph to add to our community, then we have a blank space, you know, that everything happened up to a point and then we didn't add anything new. And I think there has to be room for both.
Well, so a comment to both of you. You mentioned earlier, you talked about your background. My background is liberal arts as well, undergraduate degree in history, minors in 2 languages, German and Greek. Koine Greek, which is New Testament Greek, and then graduate work in philosophy and theology. So in philosophy, there is a concept called an antinomy, which is to hold 2 opposing positions in tension and to hold them both, right?
Yeah.
So as I listened to you, right, both of you, right, I think what you're advocating is what I would call, you know, as a sort of pseudo-philosophy guy, is an antinomy where on the one hand you have preservation and on the other hand you have, you know, innovation, new stuff, pushing the boundaries, you know, creativity, et cetera, right? And so the challenge is and I think this is your point, Sally, is that there's a strong emphasis in preservation and maybe not enough room to breathe for innovation, creativity, et cetera. And that's a problem because to your point, and I think both of you made this is a great point, is that, you know, innovation, creativity, you know, whether it's architectural or in your case, you know, as you talk about sort of one of the imperatives of public museums is to connect with people who visit. The people who visit, that demographic definition is constantly changing.
Yeah.
You know, just the arrival of smartphones, you know, starting around 2005 to 2007, but really accelerating, you know, the last 5-8 years has changed the way we do so much, right? So you got to respond to that. You can't say, no, that diorama is good enough. And we're not going to, you know, tip our hat to the kids who are walking around with smartphones. No, you better.
Yeah, and a good museum has a balance because one of the things that's amazing about, you said a word that we all associate with museums, which is diorama. But the thing is, kids still walk up to them and put their noses to them and look in because it's a window on a world that they've never seen.
Yeah.
So we don't want to create just an empty box with some touch screens because the reason they're coming to us is for something that's different than what they can hold in their hand. And what they hold in their hand can be the deep dive to learn more about something that they found really interesting, or it can be to find out what they want to see before they get there because the place is too big, like Cleveland Museum of Art. You can't see it all in one day. Where are we going to go? What are we going to hit?
Right.
It can be a tool for discovery, but they still want to come and look at the thing. We still have the things. I mean, every time everybody's like, do you worry about AI replacing museums? I'm like, have you ever been to see the Mona Lisa? Do you want to?
Right.
Because if you could experience Paris fully from your phone,
you'd never travel.
Good for you. There wouldn't be all those people going to see Taylor Swift in Paris if, you know, okay, the tickets may be cheaper, whatever. But they want to go there because they've not been there,
right.
Or they've been there and they want to go back because looking at it on their phone on Instagram isn't the same.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, listen, this conversation's been really wonderful. And as I say to people when they ask me about what's life like in Shaker, I always tell them, hey, there's a lot of great people here, but man, there's a lot of smart people here. And so I'm delighted that I had two very smart people on the show today. This has been great. So thank you very much,
Thank
Jennifer.
you.
Thank you very much,
Thank
Sally.
you for having me.
And it was fun.
It was
talking
great to
with
meet you. I know.
Yes.
I'm excited. I
Yeah.
want to send
Great.
somebody to you.
That's great.
And me to you. So there we are.
That's wonderful. Well, great. Well, again, thanks very much. And I look forward to greeting our listeners on our next show. I'm Mark Good. You've been listening to my Remarkable podcast. For more episodes like this, as well as premium content, visit my site, markgood.substack.com.